Economists and economic historians discuss historical and modern day efforts to reduce poverty. Columbia University history professor Eric Foner and Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz moderate. This is 2.5 hours.
Good evening. I'm Jim Jordan, the director of Columbia University Press. I'd like to welcome you here tonight. It occurs to me, judging by the turnout, the number of people here, that I probably don't have to tell you what the topic of tonight's conversation is, or even who the people are who are speaking. So maybe I'll start by telling you something you don't know. On November 1st, Columbia University Press published Garrett Stedman Jones' An End to Poverty, it's a question mark, an historical debate, which looks at the origins in the 18th century of the progressive idea that modern societies possess the ability to eradicate world poverty. That is the beginning of tonight's conversation. I'm grateful that the Heyman Center and particularly Akhil Bilgrami, the Johnsonian professor of philosophy, has sponsored this event, organized it, and worked with us to help commemorate and celebrate the publication of this very important book. Our moderators tonight, I will mention them in a second, and then they will go on with the program. I just want to mention a couple of things. One, you probably have noticed as you came in that there's a table out front. Our friends at Labyrinth are actually making copies available of books by several people on the panel who've written on this topic, including Dr. Stedman Jones's book. And I believe there are refreshments. I hope that's true. Don't blame me if it's not true afterwards. Our moderators tonight are Eric Foner, DeWitt Clinton Professor of American History at Columbia, author of many acclaimed books on the Civil War and Reconstruction, including The Story of American Freedom, published in 1998 by W.W. Norton, and his latest book, Who Owns History? Rethinking the Past in a Changing World, published by Hill and Wang. Told by a friend of mine at the press that Dr. Foner is probably the American historian most responsible for changing American historiography in the last 25 years, and I would add to that in a positive way. And the other moderator is Joseph Stiglitz, professor of finance and economics at Columbia Business School, executive director of the Institute for Policy Dialogue. Dr. Stiglitz is a former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, a chief economist at the World Bank, and as all of us know, a recipient of the 2001 Nobel Prize in Economics. His recent books include The Roaring '90s and Globalization and Its Discontents. I have it from a trusted source that the latter book, Globalization and Its Discontents, has been bought by, in its various forms, over 1 million people, which is a truly remarkable achievement. There are very few books in history that have sold that many copies, and I just want the panel to reflect on the fact that all of them are on the Columbia University Press backlist. So I want to thank you for joining us tonight, and I don't understand, Dr. Stiglitz, why Globalization and Its Discontents isn't out front being sold, but that's okay. Maybe they ran out of copies. Anyway, thanks for joining us, and I'd like to introduce Dr. Stiglitz first. Professor Foner first.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Let me just say briefly what the structure here is. This event, as you know, is really focused around the issues raised by two very, very important books, which have very similar titles, except one title ends in a question mark and the other doesn't. Garrett Stedman Jones, An End to Poverty, question mark, and Jeffrey Sachs, The End of Poverty. Professor Sachs is more certain about this than Professor Stedman Jones. But what we're going to do is, we have a very distinguished group of people here. We want to leave time later for questions and comments from the audience. So we have like two sections. The first, which I'm going to just introduce, the first speaker will be Emma Rothschild. She's the director of the Center for History and Economics at King's College, Cambridge, a visiting professor at Harvard also, and the author of several important books, most recently Economic Sentiments, Adam Smith, Condorcet, and the Enlightenment. And then Garrett Stedman Jones, also a director of the Center for History and Economics at King's College, professor of political science at Cambridge, and the author of several important books, including Outcast London, Languages of Class, and the more recent An End to Poverty. Gareth will respond to Emma Rothschild's remarks, and I will make a few remarks and perhaps have a little discussion among us. And then we will move to the second part of the evening, which will be introduced by Professor Stiglitz and involve Professor Sachs and Professor Sen. So, and then at the end, we can have discussion about all the issues raised here. So, without further ado, let me introduce Emma Rothschild, the first speaker tonight.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be on this platform that so admirably unites history and economics. Gareth Stedman-Jones's book is a dramatic account of a road that was not taken in the early history of economic thought. He presents an interpretation of Adam Smith that was current in the decade immediately following Smith's death in 1790, which can be described as a left view, a left Smithianism, which is strikingly unfamiliar today. He outlines how a number of individuals in that immediately post-revolutionary period, on the basis of three major perceptions, imagined a completely different society. The three major perceptions were, one, the discovery of probability and of the idea of using chance against chance. The second was Smith's discovery of the extraordinary potential of commercial society. And the third was the political transformation associated with the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And on the basis of these three big understandings, the individuals he describes came to the conclusion that the end of poverty was possible. He talks particularly about Condorcet, the French mathematician, and about Tom Paine, and he emphasizes their enduring interest in two big changes. The first was possibilities. The first was the possibility of social security, and the second was the possibility of universal education. Now, what Gareth Stedman-Jones describes in the book is a story that's in some ways a tragic story of how this moment of possibility was lost. Another road was taken, and the turning point is in what he describes as the chilling and anti-political aftermath of the French Revolution. Some of these ideas were rediscovered, he shows, in a very different political context at the end of the 19th century, in a period of very much of national construction. Well, his analysis, as you can see, has major consequences. The one with which he ends the book goes as follows. This story provides an alternative genealogy for the left. He has a touching faith that the left wants a genealogy. He even uses the language of, I think, ancestors and portraits on the walls. But as he puts it very dramatically at the end of the book, social democracy preceded socialism, chronologically, historically, and I think he would say, in some sense, conceptually. So this is the big story that he's telling. But of course, there's another story, which is that the history he's recounting is subversive in the sense that it takes away a bit of the genealogy from the right. Adam Smith doesn't belong to the right quite as much as the right has often thought to be the case. Well, it's hard to scrutinize this auditorium and the other auditorium out there, welcome. But I believe that there are quite a few historians here. And I do want to say the following to historians among us. Don't be misled by Gareth Stedman Jones's deceptively accessible and agreeable style in this book. He is doing something that's very new and very important from the point of view of our discipline, from the point of view of that, what was referred to in the context of our chairman, historiography. He's putting forward a very different periodization of modern history. He's putting forward a very different view of historical context. He's sketching an idea of a diachronic context of a couple of centuries, which historians should take into account. He's outlining quite new possibilities for the rather elderly discipline of the history of economic thought. And he's putting forward a very different view of how we do the history of ideas, particularly by putting intellectual history together with the history of ideas in practice, with the ideas of people who were trying to work out the details of policy proposals for social security and for universal education. I recommend strongly his couple of pages towards the end of the book on how friendly societies actually worked. Now, I have, there were a couple of historical points on which I'd like to ask further clarification from Gareth Stedman Jones. One has to do with the extent to which the American Revolution, as well as the French Revolution, was the stimulus for these visions of an end to poverty. I think for Tom Paine, it clearly was the case that America was an idyll of universal prosperity and equality. But perhaps for people in France by the late 1780s, the extremely intense discussions over what seemed to be the extraordinary circumstance of the persistence of slavery in the new republic had quite an impact on the extent to which the early United States was an economic model. I suppose I might also, I love the phrase about the chilly and anti-political aftermath, but I would like to point out that it was not, it was also a period of rather heated frenzy about the consequences of the French Revolution and what was happening in the world. Let me just quote to you Thomas Robert Malthus's account of Condorcet's plans. The human mind has been debased to such a fermentation of disgusting passions of fear, cruelty, malice, revenge, ambition, madness, and folly as would have disgraced the most savage nation in the most barbarous age. I mean, this was a time which was sometimes chilly. Academics were trying hard to be chilly, but it was also a time of tremendous political passion. But what I really want to comment on, and in a sense finish my remarks with, is the possible consequences for economic thought of Gareth's analysis in this very remarkable book. And I know we're sort of structured to be history first and then economics, but in the spirit of a flow of discussion, I do want to point to several issues where there really does seem to me to be a commonality between the two books we're honoring tonight and the discussion we're going to have. I think one thing that's very important in Stedman Jones's analysis has to do with the way he shows how what he describes as the naturalization of economic theory took place. the moment in the 1790s and the very beginning of the 19th century when it was no longer the right thing to talk, when one was talking about political economy, to talk about politics, but to phrase one's arguments in a language of biology, sometimes of physics, a kind of anonymous language in which political possibility was almost irrelevant. And I think those of us who are economists in the room are very familiar with the yearning among many contemporary practicing economists for what could be described as a physiological explanation of apparently political and social phenomena. And I think Gareth in the book shows where that particular desire for non-human explanations in economics comes from. A second point that seems to me to be of great interest for modern economic debates is the demonstration that, at least in the view of some of the most distinguished economists of the late 18th century, including Adam Smith, and one, I would add, other of the really classical founding economists, like Turgot, social security was not inimical to economic growth and development, but was rather something closer to being a condition for it. Now, Adam Smith didn't mean social security in our sense of pension arrangements and national insurance, although Condorcet, within 2 or 3 years of Smith's death, meant something extremely close to that. But the idea that social security, confidence in one's future, was very positive for economic development is there in the historical record that Gareth talks about. A third point that seems to me to be of great contemporary and economic importance has to do with the justifications for ending poverty that were put forward in this period. And as Gareth shows, they weren't at all to do with fear of the people. This was happening at a moment when people weren't at all afraid of the people. They were full of hope about a genuinely universal society in which every individual, without exception, took part. It was only really when these ideas came back 100 years later that the justifications for social security was along the lines of, if we don't do it, they'll come up and cut our throats. So I think that's something that's very interesting for us to think about. Finally, and this is in more in the way of a question, asking Gareth to comment on this, equality. The great work by Condorcet, on which Gareth draws, is actually about 3 different kinds of equality. One is equality between nations. A second, which is the one that's most relevant to what we're talking about today, is equality within countries. And there's a third kind of equality he talks about, and he describes as perfectibility of human beings, but one of the illustrations he gives of this perfectibility has to do with reducing inequality between men and women. Now, when we talk about Jeff's book, we will, of course, be talking about inequality and equality among nations and among individuals in disparate nations. And I'd like to end by asking, we're all obviously aware of interdependence, not only in the sense of migration of people, but of coexistence within a particular country of very different communities, as we all know, watching what's happening in France. I'd like to ask Gareth to look back to what he rightly describes as the cosmopolitanism of these early free market economists and say a bit about how they put the ideal of reducing inequality between nations with the ideal of equality within nations. And of course, that's relevant to the point about the analysis of the early American Republic and the role of slavery. But they did have ideas about a world without poverty, which was more than the social and national world of the particular countries they lived in. Anyway, it's a wonderful book. I recommend it strongly. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker to respond is Professor Gareth Stedman-Jones himself, so he can answer all of these questions.
Well, I'm very honored to be asked to participate in this launch, and I'm very honored that Emma should have given the peer to the book that she did. I should start, I think, by saying that some of the ideas in the book, some of the most important ideas, are indeed ideas that I got through partly reading Emma's work, but also talking to Emma, particularly the different ways of thinking about Adam Smith and the ways in which Adam Smith was thought about at the time. What I wanted to do as well was to generalize a thought about something which is emphasized very much in Jeff Sachs' book, I should say, and that is the importance of science to economic and social progress. And one of the things I wanted to add in my book was to say that, and this is really to make the same point that progressives, as it were, in the period between the 1790s and 1830s often made themselves, that social science was also a great advance of this period. And that goes back really to very much the work, the pioneering work done by Condorcet, applying some of the discoveries of Newton, particularly the calculus, applying it to life statistics, applying it to social choice, various things. But the point is to show that there was a universal possibility of improvement, and that the social improvement was just as important as the physical improvement or the mathematical improvement which had been devised in the era of Newton. I want to conjoin it too, and this is partly something which Emma already mentioned in her work, the point she made in her talk just now, and that is the way in which social security is not inimical to economic progress. I think it's important, some of the research which has been done by the Cambridge group in the history of population, for instance, showing the rate paid, poor rates in England from the time of the Reformation onwards. If you look at the late 17th century, for instance, you find there's a responsibility for looking after a local poor, and that the rates paid would very often make modern economists blench in terms of taxation. And this is also to link Smith in with this picture, the picture being one in which, in The Wealth of Nations and other works, of course Smith attacks the law of settlement, but if you read him carefully, he doesn't attack the fundamental idea that the poor, in a sense, have a right to relief. And that right to relief was something which by the 1780s and 90s, and until the great reaction against the French Revolution set in, was thought to be something pretty well established. It also, I think, had something to do with the possibility of England taking off before anywhere else, because it's argued, at least, I think quite plausibly, that because people knew that they had a right to relief, and not, as in France, for instance, to be dependent upon the goodwill of a particular Catholic charity or a particular parish priest, because people thought they and knew they had a right to relief, they therefore were prepared to move more frequently, and this makes for a more mobile labour market. And this in turn actually is one of the things which I think is responsible for the way in which the truly pioneering feat accomplished by Britain in the 17th and 18th century was this immense leap in agricultural productivity, the fact that that released much more of the population away from agricultural production. If you look at, as Tony Wrigley has looked, in the mid-18th century, you find that Britain has far, far more towns of 100,000 plus than anywhere else in the world. And this, of course, has dramatic effects on economic development as such, but it's made possible too by the fact that, as I say, people are not afraid to move, and indeed you have a great deal of mobility. This also, I think, is a way into thinking about what I call this first program of social democracy. I think what I'm trying to take off from is certainly something you find in Adam Smith, but you find it in other writers in the 18th century, noticing that Britain already had achieved a great leap forward in productivity. You find this in Locke, actually, comparing the situation of the labour in England with the native American on the plains, but that the cost of this was perhaps a higher degree of risk. And I think, therefore, I want to underline that as something that, in the end, that the fear of commercial society, the fear of capitalism, as it were, was above all this fear of a greater degree of risk. Greater degree of risk because with the growth of a world market, you could lose employment because of something happening at the other end of the world. And this, by the mid-18th century, is well known. And it's something which is built up and used by Paine, Condorcet, and others in arguing for the use of social security, the use of calculus, etc., in order to combat that notion of risk and in order to allow economic development to flourish. I would also want to stress, it's something which Emma had raised and is worth saying, that the context in which these proposals occur in the 1790s isn't really, as Emma just said, to ward off a social danger in the sense of a poor who might get out of control or a labour movement who might overturn relations of property. It was much more the thought that the real obstacles to progress had been, in the classic phrase, force and fraud, either the privileges of an inherited aristocracy, which in an economic sense are strongly attacked by Smith in his Wealth of Nations, or fraud, by which they meant superstition and the ways in which the encouragement of ignorance by the ruling order actually encourages factional politics and prevents improvement. So I think so the point about eliminating poverty or eliminating extreme poverty is to enable, and harnessing that with the provision of universal education, is to make possible a true republic, a republic in terms of all composed of citizens. And that's the relevance, I think, at least I briefly argue this in the book, of United States. Most theorists, most political writers in the decade or so before the French Revolution still thought that republics were either possible only in small city-states or possibly the new United States, but United States itself was only 13 small republics. It wasn't really a large industrious nation in the sense of that Europe was thought about. And really the aim then was to, or what provoked this original breakthrough, I think, was the need to think about whether a republic was possible in Europe. This comes about, I might add, contingency plays some role in my story. It comes about because everyone in the first 2 years of the French Revolution thought that A republic, the traditional meaning of the term, was a regime which, a commonwealth, something which worked for a common weal, for public welfare, and therefore that was perfectly compatible with having a king, a hereditary executive. But, of course, Louis XVI attempts to flee, he renounces the revolution, and so on. This really then presents France with a new choice, which is, can you actually have a republic in the American sense of the word? The one person who had argued that very strongly was Paine. As soon as Louis XVI flees, then one of the main architects of the revolution, a man called Abbé Sieyès, says we must, by all accounts, keep the principle of monarchy. It's either monarchy or polyarchy in Europe. It's either, in other words, monarchy or aristocracy. Aristocracy will use the ignorant poor to create factions, and before you know it, you'll have civil war and anarchy. That's the context in which Paine, and in different ways a bit later Condorcet, answer the case that actually a republic is possible in Europe. It's possible if you provide the right degree of education for every citizen, and if you provide the social security, which means that people are no longer dependent for their thoughts on some other superior group. I just want to, perhaps the last point I just want to make is that I do think that this period of the 1790s, coming at the end of the 18th century, is really a turning point in world history. It's a turning point in the sense that up until then, the thought that most of the population of the world remained poor, most of it indeed abjectly poor, was something which people thought they just had to live with. And religious explanations seemed to fit the bill. Christianity, of course, argued that the poor ye always have with you, and argued, of course, that it was your Christian duty to help your poorer brother or sister, but it didn't actually ever imagine that that condition could go away, because it was inscribed in the Bible that that was indeed God's punishment when man was thrown out of the Garden of Eden, that they sweat by sweat and toil and labor. So I just want to stress that these arguments for social security and the actual possibility of eradicating poverty, which occur at that moment, are indeed revolutionary, not just in the sense they coincide with an epoch of revolution, but they are a quite new idea of thinking about the possibilities of a polity, of its citizenship, of the prospects therein. In that sense, I want to argue that social democracy, as I call it, i.e. the conjoining of the principles of a commercial society together with social security and democracy, these three things come together for the first time then. Why they don't take off, of course, is a long story, and I try to give some picture in the book. But I think the point is, once those thoughts have been there, they can't go away. And those who want to argue against it, as people do vehemently in the course of the 19th century, are, I think, also furtively aware there is another possibility there. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Gareth Stedman Jones. My role at the moment is simply to raise a few more questions which can be addressed to both Emma Rothschild and Gareth Stedman Jones, and maybe we can have a little discussion before moving on to the second group of speakers here. As Gareth noted toward the end of his remarks, the end of the 18th century, which is the beginning of his book, is indeed a very transformative moment in the history of political thought, against which there is then a reaction, which he describes in Europe. I wonder, I guess as an American historian, I'd like to put the American experience on the table a little more than is done in the book. Emma mentioned, of course, slavery, a very, very powerful, prominent institution in America at the time of the Revolution, and the Constitution, of course, embedded in the Constitution in many ways, compromised the vision, the vision of America as a land of equality and abundance. But But even if one can bracket slavery for a moment, I think that even in the United States, a kind of reaction takes place against the ideas that Paine and others are putting forward, even before the French Revolution. And I wonder how this might fit into Gareth's model here. If you look at the Constitutional Convention, James Madison is saying precisely what the critics, not in rather more moderate language, but what many of the critics in Europe of the more optimistic view is saying. In other words, Madison says very explicitly what Emma Rothschild said wasn't being said at this moment, at least by these thinkers. That is, that you do have to fear the poor. Or he raises the question, how can you have democracy if you also have a lot of poor people? What is to prevent the poor from using the political power that democracy gives to every citizen? What is to prevent them from using that to just despoil the rich, take away the property of the rich? That is the problem of a republic, says Madison. And the solution to that, he says, is it's the structure of government we have to live with today. It's to balance power against power. It's to make it impossible for any one group to take over the whole government, although they seem to have done that lately. So this fear of, even in America where, apart from the slaves, a rather large exception, you did have a degree of economic equality quite different from the great social gradations in Europe, among many of the leaders who were Enlightenment figures and were quite knowledgeable about Paine and Condorcet and others, you did have still this fear of what are the implications of having a republic how do you keep the poor from using their privileges in this way? And indeed, Madison says in a quite non-optimistic way that economic development will actually lead to a greater and greater gap between rich and poor. He doesn't accept the notion of Smith that, the sort of left-wing version of Smith, that economic progress will inevitably lead to equality. So I just put that on the table as a question of other kinds of sources of the reaction against the kind of vision that's sketched out here in Stedman Jones's book, which preceded the French Revolution, actually. But my main point, and really the question I want to throw back to Emma Rothschild and Gareth Stedman Jones, this book is, and I think Emma kind of alluded to this a little, this book is a political book as well as a history of economic thought. It's, I think, very self-consciously a post-Cold War book. That is to say, it does not assume a world divided into a kind of either-or fashion between capitalism and communism, or whatever or a free market and statism, or whatever you want to call it. It's also a post-socialist book in the sense it assumes that the socialist economic system is no longer viable. And the question is, I guess really the question in a nutshell is this tradition that Stedman Jones maps out, is this a tradition that is still viable, should be viable politically? Is it a tradition that ought to be reclaimed now that the Cold War is over, and perhaps more nuanced political thinking might be possible? Is social insurance the key to ending poverty, which is what the thinkers that Stedman Jones is alluding to seem to say? His point, of course, Emma mentioned this, but I want to emphasize it again because it is such a break with the kind of orthodox thinking on these questions, is that modern social democracy preceded socialism. It was not a kind of watered-down version of socialism. It was not a reaction against socialism. That kind of thinking, that it's possible to accept a kind of market economy but to protect individuals against the vagaries of the marketplace, that it's possible to have a sense of community coexisting with national and international markets, that vision preceded the socialist vision and maybe survives the end of the socialist vision. Or at least I'm wondering if that's really the message of the book. That's the question I want to put to them. And if so, how do we recapture this vision because we seem to now, Gareth has just come over from England and may not be fully aware of what the situation in this country is nowadays. We live at the moment in a kind of an anti-Enlightenment society. In fact, the quotation that Emma Rothschild gave us from Malthus is actually a pretty good description of American politics today. A politics dominated by fear, by corruption, by the debasement of political language, etc. We live in a society where reason is no longer respected, faith is much more important, where science is denigrated and belief is elevated above science, where expertise is denigrated in favor of blind loyalty. That's our political situation today. So I guess I'm asking Gareth and Emma, how do we get from there to the social democratic vision that, I guess, is your book an answer to the old political question, what is to be done? So I don't know if either of you would like to respond to that.
You have to respond to the message of the book.
Well, Eric gives quite an accurate characterization, I think, of some of the thoughts that lie behind the book. I do think that in Europe, for the moment, I mean, just intellectually, I can't quite see how socialism can be put together again. And this is one of the guiding thoughts of the book, is that what seems to have happened is that not just in Britain, but in France, Germany, Italy, other European countries, I think the so-called left is now really a sort of a sad mixture of various sorts of refusals rather than something which has a very positive vision about anything. If anything, it's the imagery that it naturally uses all the time is dystopian, although that's to characterize the enemy, but it doesn't seem to have anything very positive to say on its own account. I think one of the deeper reasons for this is not just political in the sense of the end of the Cold War, but also intellectual. I think there's been a movement in the 20th century, really, ever since Adorno and Horkheimer, in probably very near here, in the 1930s, first denigrated the Enlightenment. And I think this is actually cutting off the main principle of hope in terms of what human progress is actually about. And I particularly wanted to stress in the book that the 1790s is a period where not all Enlightenments, of course, are the same thing. And of course, various of the thinkers of the Enlightenment said some pretty dreadful things. But the fact was that they were much better than the alternative. And that in this particular epoch, they came together with democratic and, as Condorcet said, much had been done for the honor of mankind, but not much for its comfort. And this was a period in which something for its comfort was designed. So in that sense, I think it is trying to say that there is something that you can go back to. And I suppose the other point about that is to say that, and this is a question that does interest me very much, and I think it is possible still to give positive answers to, and that is capitalism? Capitalism exists within a political framework. Political frameworks can be, as it were, pushed in one direction or another. They're not simply, as it were, automatically guided by the economy itself. And then, in that sense, it's perfectly possible, as these first disciples of Smith originally argued, to push it in the direction of greater equality and greater democracy. And that's really what I think the book's trying to argue, that there is a solid basis upon which a more progressive way of looking at the world can proceed, and that it's based not on some sort of ancient atavistic claims, but it's actually based on science and progress, and that we ought to get back to couching our arguments in terms of science and progress. Just on Eric's point about how you get there in the United States at the moment, well, I was encouraged to see that 7 representatives, I think it was in Kansas, or was it in Maryland? Pennsylvania. Anyway, that they rejected the idea that a designed world had to be taught as part of the science curriculum. So maybe things are beginning to shift in a more rational direction. But of course, I don't know the answer any more than I dare say anybody else does. But I do think that these situations rarely last forever. The growth of a new right had been going on in a more invisible fashion, I think, at least sort of 30 or 40 years before it actually hits the political surface in a very big way. I can only hope that new thinking on the centre and the left can actually eventually surface in what becomes a viable political alternative which will attract a popular vote.
Yes, I'd actually like to say something about James Madison, if I may. Perhaps even more depressing than what you said. But first about his dire view of the people. I mean, while it's certainly the case that that preceded the French Revolution, it didn't precede the American Revolution, and I think he, certainly if one judges by that French observer, Hector Saint-Jean de Crèvecoeur, things were pretty hairy during the American Revolution, even if one continues to bracket the enslaved population. And I would imagine that Madison had been much closer to popular anxiety about popular violence than people in Europe. And it's interesting that Madison, I think, did stay quite sympathetic to the French Revolution extraordinarily late. I think he still in 1793 accepted some kind of honor from Robespierre. But the depressing point, I think, is about Madison's analysis of the late 1790s, about how democratic societies can go horribly wrong. And he basically believed that depictions of foreign dangers and the concentration of power in the hands of the executive were the greatest single dangers to the democratic and constitutional society that they'd created so heroically. And I think that what Madison perceived in this country and in France at the very end of, in the sort of period 1798 to 1804, let's say, actually has got a lot of importance for the story that Gareth is telling, in that the conservative consensus that became so dominant afterwards wasn't just created on the basis of economic policy, but on the basis of a combination of rather conservative economic views and a very powerful coalition of fear in relation to military threats from overseas. And that was precisely what Madison was warning about in extraordinarily eloquent writings of the late 1790s. Just on a slightly more upbeat note, I think there are two aspects of Smith's earlier, happier view which are perhaps worth raising in the context of asking the question, how do we get to world equality? How do we get back to a reasonable politics? One is that Smith and Condorcet were limitlessly optimistic about the consequences of something very close to what we would call globalization. They did believe that contacts across long distances, particularly once slavery and the East India companies had been abolished, really had great potential for good. The other, and in a way even more encouraging point, is that their analysis, I think, I don't know if Gareth agrees, was based to a great extent on hedonism. And as someone, a great conservative figure like David Hume, believed this too. They thought that people simply didn't like living in societies with enormous extremes of wealth and poverty, that it was just rather a miserable daily life to walk to work and be surrounded by sort of miserably ill, impoverished people begging for money, or to see images. I mean, Madison used the word picture, not in our sense, but I think you know, they introspected, and they thought, if one can live in a different way, in a society that's not so harsh, well, it's much more fun. And of course, they could say that before all these revolutions, but I think it is a reasonable point for us to bear in mind as we look back to these comfortable and slightly smug white gentlemen in Edinburgh in the 1770s.
Gareth, you wanted to?
Could I just add one thing which I didn't answer, which you raised as a question, and that's really why social security might form a basis of something we really ought to think about as progressive and emancipating today. And I think it is worth recalling, well, first of all, it's worth recalling that if Bush, although I gather it's not very likely, but if he got away with his plans to reform social security, we'd be going back to a situation much closer to the 19th century, with all the arbitrariness that would imply about who got relief and who didn't. The second point, which relates to Emma, is a question about the international relationship between poor and rich nations. And just as a thought, I mean, of course, it's no more than an aspiration, but in some ways, the situation when we confront something like the tsunami or the earthquake in Pakistan today and so on, is very similar on a global scale to the sort of thing you found charity organizations, societies, and of various kinds in the 19th century dealing with in the context of Britain itself. And I think, at least as an aspiration, one of the things that a global social democratic program might consider is to at least try to push, when circumstances allow, for the United Nations or whatever, to provide some more systematic form of intervention based upon, yes, some form of taxation perhaps, of nations according to their means, rather than it being always up to the goodwill of individuals, which of course can be very variable given compassion fatigue and everything else. So I think there is a way in which we could think about these things as being relevant both nationally and internationally. And just the last thing on this is that I think democracy, citizenship, and economic security in some sense go together. If you want an inclusive politics, if you want people to participate more, and of course not everybody does, then in a sense arguments about social security are very basic. I mean, just as Paine was one of the best sellers of the 18th century, so Beveridge in Britain was one of the best sellers of the 20th century. And I think it's important to remember that's the point where people can see it touches their actual daily lives.
Okay, well, since we have moved from the 18th century to the present, more or less, this is a good moment. And since we're in a cinema, I could use this phrase, we can have a segue to the next part of the program, and I will turn the floor over to Professor Joseph Stiglitz, who will moderate the next session, and after that we can have an open-ended discussion among everybody.
Well, they obviously weren't able to eliminate poverty in the 18th or 17th century, and the disparity of incomes and the level of poverty around the world is clearly one of the greatest challenges that our global society faces. In fact, while there has been enormous progress in reduction of poverty in some parts of the world, such as in China, there's been enormous increases in poverty in other places, such as Africa. And that's why I think the confident title of Jeff's book, The End of Poverty, is one that obviously is both provocative and enticing. We have a wonderful opportunity here to have one of the great development economists of the world, Amartya Sen, to talk about this issue. He's made important contribution to the idea of what does development mean, is development possible, and how do we do it? And with that, just let me turn it over to Amartya to talk about whether there is going to be an end of poverty.
Well, I think it's a wonderful opportunity to discuss two really lovely books, and I'm going to comment only on Jeff's books, at least initially, but then hopefully in discussion it can be broader. And it's one of the most exciting things written recently about the nature of a problem that we are all aware of, but the extent of it and the ability to overcome it are not as widely recognized as they should be. So it's really a great privilege to have the chance of commenting on Jeff's book. Because Jeff has received acclaim not only from academics, but from everywhere. The book has a foreword by Bono. We have all seen pictures of Jeff Sachs and Angelina Jolie going off to Africa. And in fact, when I first was told that this meeting had been moved to a cinema, I thought that perhaps there's a new opening of a film that we might be able to see. So I'm somewhat disappointed that it's just such a worthy session, rather than what could have been a truly enticing picture of what's going on. I think I should emphasize, before getting on to some contents, that Jeff is, aside from what he does at Columbia, and I fully accept what Eric said about noting Columbia's achievement, because has been also a major architect of the United Nations, and the Millennium Development Goals derive a great deal from his way of understanding the problem, which is well reflected in the book. I'll begin by noting some of the contribution the book makes. It's difficult to choose. One way of thinking about it, that it's a collection of trees as well as a forest, in the sense that there are a number of interesting points made throughout. It's very difficult for me to do justice to them, because they are of independent interest, quite aside from the general thesis. But there is a forest too, and it's really on the forest that I would like to try to concentrate. I think one of the things that comes out is how dismal the nature of poverty in the world is. Economics has often been called the dismal science. I have to say that those who have said that have tended to put the focus on dismality rather than on the nature of science. In fact, the skepticism about economics as a science has, of course, been quite strong throughout. I think in Oxford, where I used to teach earlier, the word social science is never used. It's always called social studies. And I think it's more in line with W.H. Auden, who was the professor of poetry at Oxford. And in one of his poems, where he just gives playful advice to a new student about what to do, one of the lines, if I remember it right, is, "Thou shalt not sit with a statistician, nor commit a social science." And so, but this is a tremendous commitment of social science here. And it's really, I think, a very successful commitment too. The dismal nature of the world in which we live is brought out very sharply. It's certainly one of the major contributions, the gaps, as well as the absolute failures. It's a very optimistic book. I think the point that Joe has already mentioned. It's a can-do book, and it's also a discussion about how we can do it. I should say that aside from Eric's pointer to the fact that the two titles differ in terms of a question mark at the end, they also differ in the sense that the question mark at the end of the title of Garrett's book is an end to poverty, whereas this is the end of poverty. There's a definitiveness about it, which in fact, one shouldn't read great significance in titles, but there is one particular way, which is the way, as it were, that Jeff has outlined there. Now that, of course, I'm a great admirer of the book, but one might, if one were a historian, might be interested in the fact that poverty has come to end in rather different ways in different parts of the world. I mean, they haven't really come to an end, but the dramatic reduction, say, in Britain, between the kind of time in which Smith was writing and, say, today, and the dramatic reduction in Japan over, let's say, the same period, in fact, even beginning a bit later that we can see the transition, there have been big differences in terms of the focus on education and a human resource-based change in Japan, which is a much stronger force than in what happened in the European history. So in some ways one could wonder whether this is taking too unitary view of how poverty come to an end or not. And this may be a question to discuss at some stage. I don't think it diminishes the value of the work in any way, because it's the one which is the most likely way of thinking about the end of poverty, as Jeff's work, among others, have taught us to think. I think there's another contribution of the book is to point out that in order to do this, you will need, aside from all the other issues like institutional change, etc., you will need a lot of money. If the best things in life are free, then removal of poverty is not a best thing. It clearly will need a great deal of money. But it turns out that the money needed are still well within what people standardly face in the world, the richer countries do. And Jeff points out that while the United States may spend $450 billion on military expenditure, it spends $15 billion only on what could be thought to be development, global development. And the nature of Jeff's contribution is to point out that while the money that's needed is badly needed, and it's a large amount of money, it's within affordable limits. And there are reasons for pursuing that line, both on grounds that this is a very important thing to do, the ethical argument is there, but there's also the self-interest argument on which Jeff places a fair amount of emphasis, and this is where it relates to also the debate that we heard between Eric and Emma and Garrett about Madison and the fearing of the poor and so on. But this is happening at the global level. And the connection between, as Jeff says, hard evidence has established strong links between extreme poverty abroad and the threat to national security that results from it. So I think there are, and that is definitely a self-interest-based argument that maybe defense is best done, not by so much military expenditure, but by helping in the process of development. And that, again, is an important point. Now, I think Jeff will never forgive me if I just agreed with him and did not give him a chance to debate. So I have to consider what are the subjects on which I could give him a chance to debate. It's not very easy, since I do admire the book greatly, and I do want to emphasize a couple of points which I've heard people express, which I don't think are possible charges that can be held. One of them is that Jeff Sachs does not take institutions terribly seriously, because he does discuss a great deal about it, and he's not suggesting that money alone, as I think that's a dreadful phrase, throwing money, what can it do? He's not, this is not a view that throwing money will do it. It's a view that in order to carry out everything else, you do need money in addition to everything else. The argument that it is still a very pro-globalization book is perhaps correct, in the sense that it is certainly quite pro-globalization. On the other hand, Jeff gives reason to think why the nature of global economy and trade could be very helpful to the process of economic development if people are allowed to enter that arena in a way that they are not today because of initial conditions connected with health, connected with lack of education, connected with grinding poverty in general, make it difficult. So I think in all these respects, I would argue that Jeff presents a pretty balanced picture, contrary to what you might sometimes hear for those who do not like the rather radical message of Jeff's book. Even when it comes to anti-globalization movement, I was interested to note that Jeff's summary of it is that the anti-globalization movement has made a number of contributions, mostly for good, I think is the expression he uses. And I think that's consistent with his basically pro-globalization stand. And at some stage, I would like to hear Joe Stiglitz on that subject, and because there is a difference in this position. But I think one way of thinking about it is that the anti-globalization movement have brought to the fore a number of questions which are very important, which pro-globalization people have to address. And one of my complaints is that some of the pro-globalization books simply don't do it. And Jeff, taking his position, which he has taken for over decades since I have known him, which is basically in the pro-globalization direction, to take these questions seriously and ask how could we deal with these difficulties which seem to accompany what may be otherwise very positive globalization movements. Having said that, now what are the points on which we may actually have mild or not so mild disagreements, if there are any? I think beginning with, I think eventually there's one point where I think I want to put focus, but let me get on with one or two other things before that. One of them is that I think the debate about whether there is evidence that terrorism and poverty are deeply related, I think that evidence has to be seen in a way that is more historical than in fact emerges here, in the sense that quite often dreadful things happen to people, poverty, famine, without anything much happening in exchange. I remember as a child living through the Bengal famine at the age of 9, being struck by the fact that you had food shops, particularly sweetmeat shops, with glass windows, none of which were broken in that period. The Irish famine of the 1840s, which is not often recognized, killed a higher proportion of the population of a nation than any other famine anywhere in the world in the recorded history. And yet these were extremely peaceful times. Ship after ship sailed down the Shannon, laden with food being carried from starving Ireland to well-fed England by the pull of market forces. The English had the money to buy it, the Irish did not, since aside from whatever the potato famine had done, it eliminated the Irish people's ability to buy food. It didn't have any ability to compete with the English buyers. It wasn't the government conspiracy, it was something which the market economy arranged. But while that was happening, not one of them was interfered with, not one. Extremely peaceful and quiet. You heard dreadful statements. Trevelyan, who was in charge of the Treasury at that time and had a certain amount of responsibility for the way the famine proceeded, had, among other things, made this extraordinary remark, which still remains one of my favorite statements about the understanding of famines by the ruling classes. Trevelyan, in discussing the cause of the famine, thought that one of the reasons was, he was talking about the overdependence on the potato of the Irish, so therefore blaming the Irish for having brought it on themselves, just in the same way that, well, actually that's a long tradition, even going back to the 16th century. Spencer's Fairy Queen has plenty of that, of blaming the Irish for their own difficulty. But Trevelyan's statement was the real trouble is that the culinary art of the Irish peasant woman does not exceed the boiling of a potato. Now, it's quite an extraordinary remark for many reasons. One of them, of course, that the English usually don't make international criticism of culinary art. So it's quite exceptional in that respect. But also, as a theory of famine, it's actually great. I mean, I've got another about 10 or 15 remarks of that kind, but this is certainly one of the high flyers in the theory of famine. But the interesting point is that it's not the case that terrorism is not linked with it, because nothing happened then, much. But for more than 150 years after that, rebellion in Ireland, wanting dissociation from the British Isles, including terrorism in England, was driven by the memory of the Irish famine. It figures again and again very strongly. So Jeff's thesis is right, but the hard evidence that we're looking for isn't an instantaneous hard evidence. It has to be a historical one. I think today what's happening in the world with maybe a sixth of African population being threatened with extinction, and the world doing nothing. And what the English could be blamed for is not causing the famine, but not doing anything to provide relief. But I think when 50 years from now, the world looks back, and the Africans too look back at what the world did when a continent was threatened with more than decimation, I think would be a factor of great importance. So that adds in some ways to the importance of Jeff's work, but the evidence has to be more concerned with history over time, and to look at that would be one way to enrich the argument, I would say. I'd say also there's always, in my mind, a danger of putting too much focus on self-interest, enlightened self-interest in dealing with poverty. It sells ethics short. It also has the effect of saying that somehow Americans and the Europeans have no particular reason to do anything about Africa unless somehow their own interest is affected. Now, we know that's not the way actually people think. It's amazing to see when you have questionnaires, that's not the way they think. We should ask people, would you like to give money to others? Well, by and large, they will say no. And you have these peculiar surveys that come out, like there was one, I think, reported in New Yorker about, I think, almost 7, 8 years ago, in which a lot of Americans were asked, does America give too much aid? The answer was yes. A little more, or drastically more, should it be cut by 5%, 10%, 50%, 80%, 90%, etc. I think they took the highest cut that they wanted to. They didn't want to eliminate it, but they would like to cut it by 90%. Then they were asked to estimate how much, what percentage of the American GNP is given out as aid. And since they estimated by a factor to be higher by a factor of 200. They were, in fact, suggesting, after a 90% cut, a dramatic increase in aid. I think the basic question is that people do have sympathy with each other. And one of the ways why I think this kind of work is important is that we live in a world in which our alternative identities are in a state of certain amount of conflict. And it's the marshalling of an anti-Western identity, which has been particularly useful for the fundamentalist terrorists. That is, I think that's in a sense a wrong description, but terrorism connected with religious fundamentalism. And the competition with this comes from a certain global understanding. One of the reasons for praising anti-globalization movement is that it has, despite its name, provided a vision of a global identity. I mean, these are not local boys in Genoa or London protesting. They come from all over the world. And in some way, there's a kind of vision of the world which could survive even without the terrorist threat coming in, just on grounds that there is a certain association between human beings across the world. And I'm always struck that how people would respond quite negatively about just giving money, but when you tell them what it is about children not getting this and not getting that, and organizations like UNICEF and Oxfam, which I was very privileged to preside over for a while, has done a great deal to just bring that reflective imagination together. Now, moving to another issue, what about this institutional question? I think what can certainly be said that there is no neglect of institutions here. What Jeff is saying, that even with all the institutional changes you're making, you will need a lot of money. But then there's another question, which is this, that how are you going to bring about these institutional changes, and what is the process? Now, I know that democracy has ended up getting a bad name, since that is now the slogan with which wars are fought, rather than being the way human beings should organize themselves in a society. I was very pleased that Guy's focus on social democracy brings out some of the concerns about democracy in general. But I think that remains a very important thing. And if there is one thing I am really concerned with, worried about in the Millennium Development Goal approach, is that between the Millennium Declaration, which had all the social and political features, including the issue of liberty, free speech, media, and democracy, by the time we come to Millennium Development Goals, they are really the fairly narrow, much narrower goals of the kind that we see expressed here. Now, I think it's to the credit of Jeff that he has given such a powerful form to the Millennium Development Goals, and I think the United Nations has been very lucky to get Jeff's help in that. I said I ought to declare an interest also, since I'm also a $1 income a year advisor to, I guess not honorary because $1 counts as money, to the Secretary General, but I certainly haven't come anywhere near being able to contribute in a way that Jeff has done. But if only by emphasis on Millennium Development Goals, the rest of the Millennium Declaration has somewhat receded in the focus that it tends to get. And I think when we try to look at the future of the world, we have to take a picture of it, of which this is one extremely important part of the story, both because democracy is important in itself, and also because democracy has a real contribution to make, which actually Jeff does acknowledge. In fact, it's a question of focus I'm looking off. It's a question of emphasis rather than anything else. And there are other issues which people may be concerned with. And I would end with couple of comments on that, which we could argue about. One is that as the work of some of the medical scientists, like Sir Michael Marmot, brings out that mortality has a lot to do with inequality as such. It's really quite striking how being sat upon and being at the bottom of the ladder really influenced your mortality rate. Initially, people were somewhat worried that there must be over-explanation, because if mortality is due to tuberculosis or lung cancer connected with smoking, how could it be because of your being in the bottom rank? Well, what I think what Michael Marmot has done is to establish how it is precisely these behaviors like over-drinking, over-smoking, whether it be in former Soviet Union or be smoking, which is characteristic now of many countries in the world and a large spreading in some of the poorer countries as they become economically more prosperous, like China and to some extent India. And I think that linkage of inequality with mortality is an important one to look at, which is not connected in exactly that way. Now, on the other point I want to make is the one that comes out of Garrett Stedman Jones's book particularly, namely the focus on social security. And that is extraordinarily important. And if if you look at a country which has been really tremendously successful, China, in 1979, when it moved in the in the direction of radical reform, it needed to. It had a dreadful economy. However, between the revolution and 1979, because of the fact, despite quite a lot of madness of the policies that the regime pursued, they did expand the basic education and basic health care in a quite a fundamental way. And that impacted on living standard. At 1979, the Chinese had a life expectancy of 68 years, which is quite high for the kind of income they had, compared with India, for example, which, if you take the corrected income, there wasn't really that much difference at that time. India had a life expectancy of 54 years, a gap of 14 years. In a relatively little noted change in 79, the Chinese not only introduced the market economy, they at one step, abolished social security, which means instead of everyone having an entitlement either against the state, if you're in urban areas, or against the local communes or cooperatives, against them to have health care free, suddenly you had to buy your health insurance. And you will see that in the effect of it in the subsequent period. India's achievements are very moderate in health care, but if it still turns out that since 79 to today, the life expectancy in India has grown 3 times as fast as that in China, the sudden abolition of social security and the retrogression that resulted from it had a lot to do with it. And so had the lack of democracy, not being able to criticize the hospitals for dreadful things. We know how bad the Indian health services are because we read about them every morning in the papers. And if you write nasty things, as the trust, Pratichi Trust I set up with after I got the Nobel in Bangladesh and India, the Indian one has been concerned with the, among other things, about the health delivery. And every time we criticize it, we always get the front page. So I think that is a great help. I mean, you couldn't get a situation like in the SARS epidemic when something would emerge in November and that could not be revealed or could be concealed until the following April. So I think in all kinds of ways there is a connection between the health service focus. By the way, if you want to really get contrast with on the health service side, the thing to look at are those parts of India which had health service like that of China, like Kerala did. And in 1979, China had a life expectancy, as I mentioned, 68. Kerala had 67. China has now 71. India has 64. Kerala has 76. And if you look at infant mortality, China and Kerala had exactly the same, 37 per thousand. Now China has 30, Kerala has 10. which indicates what China could have got if it had not suddenly abolished the social services at that time, and if it had a democracy which it allows criticism, combined with the commitment of a left-wing political kind, which had united China and Kerala in the earlier period. So I think these are the kind of issues that one could raise, but in a sense, it's really, to some extent, beside the point to raise it, because a book makes a major contribution, and in this case, it makes more than one major contribution. As I mentioned, it does do really significantly identifying the nature of poverty, what can be done, what is needed, and so on. And we have extraordinary reason to be grateful to Jeff Sachs. And it's the nature of the success of the book that it makes us look for a bit more even for him, and perhaps there will be a sequel along with the next Jolly Sachs film, if you want to see it. Thank you.
Jeff, do you want to tell us about the sequel?
I appreciate you mentioning the movie because you really point out any hardship in the interest of fighting poverty is worth taking. It's really a privilege to be together with all of this wonderful panel to be bookends of another wonderful book with essentially the same title, and also to hear my book praised and critiqued by Amartya, who's a hero for all of us. And if he didn't think that he was playing a big practical role, he should know, and he does know, that the MDGs have Amartya Sen written all over them, and in all the concept, the philosophy, the whole impetus for these goals. First, in the sense which I really like and appreciate, that the Millennium Development Goals are about poverty in many dimensions. It's not about getting poverty down to $1 a day. It's Amartya Sen who told us why that was such a silly measure of poverty. Poverty is about capabilities. Poverty is about lack of access to education, lack of access to health, lack of access to gender equality. And the MDGs are all about that. And it's no accident, because it was Amartya's influence and Mahbub el-Haq and others who created these concepts that find them embedded in the international goals right now. It's also his inspiration of pointing out the lessons from Kerala or Costa Rica and other places for many years that said you can do this at a very low level of income. So you don't have to end the relative gaps between rich and poor to make decisive benefits in the well-being of today's suffering people. And that's an Amartya Sen standard and lesson that he taught for the whole world. So the Millennium Development Goals are a tribute to all that Amartya has contributed directly inside the UN and, of course, in teaching the whole world about these issues. Also teaching me about these issues, because he was, in a great way, my inspiration and direct teacher on so many of these challenges. I think it is wonderful that we're talking about this in the context of the Enlightenment. I knew I wanted to end my book coming back to the Enlightenment, because that has been what I hoped always in my life to be my intellectual base and inspiration, and believe that what the Enlightenment great figures, Kant and Condorcet and Smith and Hume and others had to offer is of extraordinary lasting value. It is shocking that in much of the late 20th century, there was a powerful current of thought that said the Enlightenment not only had failed, but that it was a danger. It was a danger of putting rationality above other things. It was the naivete of constructivism. It was the genesis of Mao and Stalin and so many other disasters. I think that's all hogwash, actually, because I think what the Enlightenment figures offered us was first a brilliant human spirit and empathy, first and foremost. Second, a universalism that said people's lives are valuable anywhere, and a sense of universality in the human nature, the human purpose, and the human empathy. Third, I think it's absolutely wrong, in my understanding, and the discussion about Madison. I love Madison. I think he wrote a heck of a good Constitution, actually. The discussion, to me, points it out. The Enlightenment figures were not naively going off about the perfectibility of man. They were quite realistic about the mix of human nature, about human sympathy and empathy and greed and avarice, and all of it mixed together. And Adam Smith, who was our greatest champion of globalization, also has one of the most remarkably humane discussions of globalization in The Wealth of Nations, when he talks about the fact that while it is the case, he says, that the two greatest events in the history of mankind were discovering the sea routes to the Americas and to Asia from Europe, as he says, thus linking all parts of the world for the satisfaction of mutual wants. It happened accidentally to be the case that when these linkages were made, the disparity of military force was so powerful that the result was devastation for the native inhabitants of the East and the West Indies. And so he looks forward to the time when there will be a sufficient balance of force so that all parts of the world can benefit from globalization. This is not naive, first of all. It is not knee-jerk, a simplistic vision that these powerful forces necessarily benefit everybody. And what I find the most extraordinary thing of all is that he cared about what was happening to the native inhabitants of the East and West Indies. That, to me, is the essence of the Enlightenment. And so the idea of pinning disaster on these thinkers is really a complete misunderstanding of what they believed about human nature, and more fundamentally, how they thought in a humane way we should view these very problems themselves. To me, the key, actually, of all of it, although there are many aspects, it's the role of reason, it's the universalism, it is the belief in constructivism that I'll use in a positive way, that social institutions can be changed and need to be changed and need to be designed. And I think that's a very powerful, and that is our modern vision of politics that I think is a correct vision. But what I find probably most remarkable of all is the vision of science and the idea that ideas and knowledge can play such a decisive role in human betterment. And I think Condorcet's sketch of historical progress, of the progress of the human mind, is certainly one of the most incredible thoughts ever to pass through a human mind. The vision of it and the correctness of what he thought was startling. And I ended up quoting it at the end, and I want to, my book, and I want to quote it for you here just for a moment. He said that the useful arts are bound to follow that of the sciences upon which they depend for their theory, and to have no other limit. So he's already talking about technology following science and what it can do. He envisioned, quote, an ever smaller tract of land will yield a quantity of more useful and valuable commodities. It will be possible to select for each kind of soil the crop satisfying the greatest needs, and to choose among crops satisfying similar needs, those satisfying a greater number of people with less work and less real consumption. Progress in medical care, healthier nutrition and accommodation, a mode of life developing strength through exercise, will inevitably extend the average lifespan and assure human beings more consistent health. It seems clear that advances in preventative medicine, rendered more efficacious by the progress of reason and of social order, will in the long run extinguish transmissible and contagious illnesses, as well as the common illnesses caused by climate, foodstuffs, and working conditions. It's unbelievable anyone on the run, as he was at the time in 1794, from the extremists of the revolution, much less anyone with the peace of mind to think about these things, could have foreseen the Green Revolution, the science of modern medicine, the ability to control communicable diseases. And I put a lot of stress on that insight because I think that while the social context is vital, it is this progress of the mind that has been fundamental in the breakthrough from extreme poverty all over the world. And it's also the basic reason why I believe it can be accomplished now, because I think the tools that we have now to do this are phenomenally powerful. And the essence of what I believe is missing right now is the application of known and proven tools for this purpose. The book actually could have had, incidentally, a question mark in the title. It is not saying that there is the end of poverty at hand. It's the first words that I write in the book. This book is about ending poverty in our time. It is not a forecast. I am not predicting what will happen, only explaining what can happen. Currently, more than 8 million people around the world die each year because they are too poor to stay alive. Our generation can choose to end that extreme poverty by the year 2025. This has a question mark exactly the same way. It's a question for me of choice. So what are the choices, and why isn't it happening? I do try to add something here to how economists are thinking about this issue. I get a little bit hit around the head by my colleagues for it, but I think it's important. And probably by stressing it, I understress some other things that are also important. The book is not a lot about markets and about improving market efficiency. It's not a lot about politics and improving political institutions. It's not a lot about what Amartya brought into development thinking about culture, society, gender, identity, although all of those things I believe are critical and they're mentioned but only in passing. And that is partly a little bit about polemics, that I'm trying to add something into the discussion which I believe has not been part of the discussion adequately. And that is that the poorest people in the world today, where we find them in a world where extreme poverty has declined sharply, very sharply all over the world, the poorest people today tend, not as a given, not automatically, certainly not in every case, but they tend to live in physically marginal environments on the planet. And I take that to be extremely important and very much neglected in the way we have tended to approach these problems. The poor tend to live in places that are vulnerable to drought. They tend to live in mountains and forest areas. They tend to live in malarious zones. They tend to live far from ports, far from international trade routes. And actually, I'm gratified that Adam Smith pointed all of that out in the book 1 of The Wealth of Nations. He's only remembered for, he's remembered for his brilliant insight that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market, but he's only remembered today, or quoted today. It's not even quoted today because almost nobody who quotes him has ever opened a page of Smith. But most of all the Wall Street Journal editorial page, the single most disgraceful page in American life today. But what Smith says in Book 1 is that the extent of the market is limited not only by government intrusion, which was one of his concerns, but by being far away from where the economy is developing. And so he talks about the fact, actually, that economies develop from the coast into the interior, and they develop where there are navigable rivers, and they develop where resource base is adequate, and the soils are good, and there's access to energy resources. So he actually has it all there, which is reassuring. If it was complete, he doesn't know everything because a lot of science hadn't come yet, but and a lot more, no doubt, will come. But he got this basic physical reality of human life brought to bear. And it's a point that I insist on and that I think is practically very important. And the reason I think it's practically important is if you face up to the reality that lots of poor people are poor in part because they get malaria 6 times a year, then you're also led to Condorcet's wisdom that actually we can control malaria and that it becomes an important part of our arsenal for fighting poverty. We can actually even pave roads now. We can put up cell phone towers. We can put up internet backbone and local wireless at extremely low cost for villages that are otherwise not connected to regional and world economies. We can use treadle pumps to pump water for people that would otherwise face risks of transient drought. And so the point of stressing the physical environment is that it's important, and it leads us to some very practical considerations. What are the real conditions in which people live in their poverty today? It's not accidental where they are. Now, I just will close by saying that putting stress on that, partly as a polemical device, no doubt, mainly because I think it's extremely important and practical, has led to criticisms that I underplay politics. I underplay corruption. I underplay many things that we talk incessantly about. And I'll put incessant there because if we talked equally about drought, improved seed varieties, anti-malaria bed nets, vaccines, control of lymphatic filariasis, and 100 other very practical things that we could be doing to measurably improve the life of hundreds of millions of people, we would also need to be talking about all the rest as well. We don't right now. So we put, partly because of a disease of our profession, I fear, which is the way that it's transmitted, not with the people here, but too much from the classroom to the classroom to the classroom to the classroom, not to life as it's lived and life as it's seen. We have forgotten a lot of the basic physical realities in which the world has lived, and we've left ourselves, therefore, neglecting a lot of the most powerful tools that we have to actually get the job done. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And I think you, the message that Jeff brings in the book, I think, is a very convincing one. The fact is that I think he identifies the fact that there is an enormous amount that can be done with money. It's not the whole solution. And I think that one needs to put into perspective the kinds of dollars he's talking about are really minuscule compared to what we are spending in other areas. So Jeff in his book makes a very compelling case that we can afford it. If we can spend as we have been spending, the estimates are that we will have spent on the war in Iraq over $1 trillion. As a result, you know, economists use present discounted value of expenditure. If we can afford that, we can obviously afford much smaller amounts to end poverty in the developing world. I want to ask a couple questions where we're drawing together the themes of the two books. Well, this is not the main theme of Jeff's book. One of the big issues is what kind of economy is likely to reduce poverty and promote economic growth. It was obviously the question that Adam Smith was concerned with, and it is the perspective of is social democracy the social democratic vision a way most likely to reduce poverty, or is the conservative interpretation of Smith, which is the one that most people study, which is a free market economy, most likely. One of the, I believe very strongly that the social democratic model is the right one, and what is interesting here is the power of ideas, and including bad ideas. In Europe, probably the most successful set of countries, both in growth and poverty, are the Scandinavian countries, which really have a social democracy. What is interesting is that the conservatives have spread a rumor that Sweden has abandoned its welfare state. And they've been very good at spreading their rumor. And what all that Sweden did was to reduce, say, the percentage, when you get unemployed, rather than getting 80% of your income while you were working, you may be getting 70%. But that's compared to the United States, where it's around 30%. So that's not an abandoning of a social protection model. They've readjusted it. And they've emphasized enormously education. And the result has been enormously fast economic growth, and all the human development indicators are much better than in the United States. The only thing where they're not doing as well as the United States, they have a much smaller percentage of the population in prison. It's probably less than a tenth that in the United States, but I don't think anybody can quite compete with us in that. What I think is interesting about Stedman Jogues's book is that he it illustrates how an idea, Smith gets converted and understood in a very different way from what Smith may have intended. And the power of ideas is very important. And what I found very interesting is one of the results of my own research has been to show that Adam Smith's invisible hand, which is not maybe the main idea of Adam Smith, but the Adam's invisible hand, the reason that it often seems invisible, as I've said many times, is that it's not there. That is to say that the economy is not, in general, general efficient when there's imperfect information or imperfect risk markets, which is always. This result that I proved about 20 years ago, the fact is that it undermines, it takes away the intellectual foundations of the conservative, of the free market doctrines. And let alone the other aspects that the models that have been used to justify, to analyze Adam Smith's invisible hand have assumed that there's no changes in technology. Well, the heart of development is changes in technology, learning. They're all excluded from that analysis. So there's actually a very strong presumption against the Adam Smith's invisible hand doctrines. And yet, in the last 20 years, it hasn't changed the teaching of economics in most universities around the world. They still continue to teach these results as if there was not a contrary theory. And it's really, I think, I'll pose it as a question now, how do you change the thinking when obviously the underlying theorems, the underlying analytic results aren't there, but they continue to preach the stories as if they were. The other question I want to raise, following along the remarks that was made about the role of the balance of power in the evolution of in the end of poverty and the consequences of opening up of globalization. Well, those same issues are with us today as they were in the 19th and 18th century. It's not just military power, although that's playing a role, but economic power. And we are now in the midst of a set of trade negotiations which was called the development round. And basically, the United States and Europe have taken the view that, yes, they promised a development round in Doha, but that was 4 years ago. Now they are all consistently reneging on every one of the promises, or almost every one of the promises that they've made. So while money is important, it is also the case that one needs to have, I think, to have an end to poverty, to have growth, you need to have trade opportunities, but the way the global trading system is very adverse to the developing countries. Finally, I guess I'd like to remark, I'd like to ask a question of several of the panelists of the relationship and how they respond to the question of the relationship between democracy and development, which I think is a key question. Marx has explained very well how, in fact, there's been an erosion of the social protection in China since its growth has begun. At the same time, China has been the most successful country in reducing income poverty. And many people say, well, it is because they have they do not have democracies. I think it's important to realize that India, for the last 20 years, has been growing at 6%, and it is a viable democracy. So, but I'd like to hear their comment on this issue of is China's success because of its lack of democracy or in spite of it?
Anyone who, I think we could just have an open discussion for a bit, so anyone who wants to respond, please do.
Specifically to that one. I think, you see, the issue of connection between democracy and development is a really exciting and interesting one to look at, because democracy is basically bringing in the impact of public reasoning into policy making. And if you take China, the thing to recognize is that its period of great success, and in terms of life expectancy and so forth, as I was discussing, the big change happened pretty early, in fact, before the economic reform. Incidentally, if you take the post-reform period, the reduction of poverty was much sharper in the 1880s than in the 1990s. In the 1880s was the period when the agricultural reforms were the primary force, and the period, as it were, of globalization. I'm very pro-globalization in many ways, more than you are probably, but nevertheless, I have to say the reduction of poverty was much, much sharper. It's only now we are getting some indication, I gather from Carl Luskin, that there's some indication that poverty, now at last the inequality level, after having sharply increased, is slightly reducing, even though last year the poverty number actually went up in China. But to explain what happened in any of these countries, China, Cuba, Vietnam, is to bear in mind that they are coming into the people who are pretty anti-democracy in part of a, whatever it is, dictatorship of proletariat, whatever the slogan is. They come in at the top of a popular public movement. That is, if you look at the literature, which I tried to spend some time looking at, admittedly but in translation, of the Chinese Communist Party discussions in the 1940s, the striking thing is not only that they're talking a great deal about democracy, but also the commitment to do the argument that it is the way to serve the interests of the people is very strong. And so, in fact, when you're looking at what happened in the China early period, I think one should not underestimate the value of it coming through on the top of what was a participatory movement. Now, I know that there's a new view out which indicates that Mao not only made all those mistakes later on, but even at the beginning he did nothing. And indeed, the Long March was nothing, etc. I haven't read the book, but I've seen a review of that. I've seen also some critique of that too. But in terms of certainly the readings that I have seen of the Chinese Communist Party discussion of that period in the 40s, I think it's hard to not see a democratic element in it. Now, institutionally, that's not the way they went. And I think, in a way that, this is not the subject time to discuss it, that Marxism, in a sense, had a feature of being perhaps the most apolitical theory imaginable, in the sense that it did not have a theory of political organization. Because if you think about it, the dictatorship of proletariat, it wasn't clear where that was going to come from. And it paid a very big penalty in not having any interest on oppositional politics, in encouraging public reasoning, public discussion, kind of part of the Enlightenment value. If the Enlightenment value on one side was this humanity, the universalism, and the concern with poverty and so forth, another side was the enormous importance of public discussion, and the subject in which I spend most of my time in social choice theory, of which Condorcet, who was quoted earlier by several authors, several people here, was the prime mover, was of course directly a result of Enlightenment thinking. Social choice theory emerged in that period among French mathematicians. So I think you have to think about the early successes on which, to some extent, Vietnam, even today, Vietnam hasn't done as much of its opportunity, but it has a basic educational base which India lacked. And in some ways it could be said that India, though it adopted the democratic framework, it came into office without that kind of a public commitment. It was much more upper-class-led movement in a way than the Chinese were not. So I think the issue of democracy is more complex, and as I would argue that even though the Chinese have continued to have very high rate of economic growth through the period of post-reform period, we have to bear in mind two things. First of all, they did not have it in an equally undemocratic period, namely earlier than reform. People always talk about South Korea having success without being a democracy until recently, never mention North Korea. As whenever there is a thesis about democracy being not so good, they refer to Singapore, not to Afghanistan or Somalia. And so I think there is one has to, if one wants to make a case against democracy, there's a little more, I think what Jeff calls hard evidence, as he was in that sentence I quoted, to be looked at in this context.
Jeff,
I wanted to respond to a couple of things that Joe asked about and mentioned. First, in terms of resources to do something about poverty, I think we should be thankful to George Bush for one thing at least, which is that he did explain to the American people exactly what 0.7% of GNP is, because that's exactly what we spend on the Iraq War each year right now. So he even defined where we're going to find the revenues for this foreign assistance when we end the war, and we can move pretty quickly from killing a lot of people to saving millions of lives per year for that money. The best evidence is that if you actually deployed this level of resources for the main categories of killer diseases, we could be saving up to 8 million lives every year. This is not a small contribution to human well-being, and we know that the money is there. We just have chosen not to do it. In terms of the question of social democracy, it is striking how the Nordic countries now do rank so highly in virtually every dimension of economic performance and consistently. And it is a major I'd say, a major challenge and provocation to the profession, our profession, that has not been faced almost by anybody, because, like you say, it's either assumed away or it's laughed away that that's not relevant because it's some exceptional circumstance. But I think that what it does show is what you said, but in a very practical way. What is it that makes Sweden work so well, or Norway work so well? It is a social democracy. These are social democracies in the sense that they're spending 50% of GNP on taxation for public services. So there's no question that this is a different economic strategy. It's a significant, macroeconomically different strategy. I believe that they do two things that are absolutely essential. One is that they are open economies, and so they are allowing market forces to play in the productive sector while having the social services operating at the same time. But the second thing that they've done that I think is critical is investing in innovation through the public sector as well as the private sector, to understand exactly what you said, Joe, that if knowledge is the base of the economy, then a strong investment in knowledge directly can even overcome a 50% tax burden and maintain very high productivity and very high standards of living. Sweden has the highest ratio of research and development spending to gross national product of any country in the world today, with the possible exception of vying with South Korea. As a matter of fact, the two go up and down close together. And it's that combination of that triple portfolio of openness, innovation, and the social commitment that I think makes these unique success stories. And they are absolutely directly threats to the received theory of the profession. And one of the great ironies for me also on the political side of it is one of the most celebrated books of the second half of the 20th century is The Road to Serfdom by von Hayek. Never has a book been more wrong, it seems to me. And the reason that it's wrong is that it said, if you do something intervening in economic life, you will actually end up destroying political democracy as well, not only your economy, but also political democracy. And he got it completely wrong, it seems to me, because what we have is highly interventionist states, albeit well-targeted, seriously thought out, along Condorcet's line, I might say, might add also, because it is very much in this social security dimension, without any loss of democratic virtues, it seems, because not only is it the economic indicators that rank so high, but it's also the political indicators that rank so high in the Nordic countries. They're the very top of the list in every good governance ranking as well. The least corruption, the most transparency, the most public participation, the least role of money in politics in its nefarious ways that play out here. And so I think also the theory that government intervention taints democratic force was proved wrong. Finally, I wanted to note that fortunately you've given an answer to what do you do about a profession that's so impervious to the facts. Well, together with me, you started a new department and a new PhD program. So that's one way to do it.
I think we have some microphones.
Yeah, the people have to use the microphones. You call on someone.
Well, I think she has the microphone, so why don't you, yes,
Yeah,
okay.
bring the microphone to people who can use it. Right.
This is regarding the allusions that were made on the political framework and the institutional framework. How does the world move from its current state to an equilibrium where the poverty is alleviated if the people who are going to implement this change do not have the right incentives to do so? And if a monitoring agency is appointed, how does that agency not become corruptible and who monitors it and how do we ensure that it goes the right way? Probably Dr. Sen could take this.
Okay, why don't we take a couple questions, and because we have a limited amount of time. Do you want to move your? There's another microphone, isn't there?
Yeah, the other side, I think, isn't it?
I'm Pia Alilanttinen. I'm interning at the Finnish mission of the UN. I would like to ask the panelists, how do you think the Scandinavian countries can make the social democracy their biggest export product? Like within which framework or institutions, for instance, in the context of the United Nations or something else? Thank you.
Okay, is there another question on this side? Just take it up there. Yeah.
I had a specific question, kind of in the context of our larger discussion, for Mr. Sachs regarding his comments on malarious areas. The most disgraceful page in America just the other day had a brief editorial lambasting UN and other NGOs' policies toward using insecticides, particularly DDT, in some of these areas, and I was wondering if you could just comment on that briefly. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, on this side?
Yeah. I have a question for all of you on the panel. I'm wondering if any of you is familiar with the work of Hernando de Soto, who proposes that to alleviate poverty in the world, all you need to do is give legal ownership to people, and the total amount of this transfer of property is supposed to amount to over $5 trillion. So.
Okay. Is there a question on this side? Yeah.
Thanks. I come from Peru, and I have a couple of questions for Professor Sachs. My first question is that what is behind, if you have thought about what is behind that the no willingness of powerful countries of ending poverty in the developing world, but I would actually say also ending poverty in the powerful countries. So, because in 1970s also there was a Brandt report also pointing out how unequal is the world, but 35 years from that time, still we are worse or same. So I want to know which mechanisms, which kind of power is really to begin to think beyond that just the willingness or not willingness to do it. And the second point is that when I hear you, I see something like saying, this is the answer, this is the way to end poverty. But I think maybe in Peru, maybe different, because you have a great knowledge of what's happening on certain parts of the world. I have a little knowledge of what happens in my country, and I just came back from Peru, and I see that poverty, for example, is expressed by a family who wakes up in a Sunday and don't have anything for making a lunch, and they have to go to the streets to see if something in the informal economy could be done, helping something to bring back 10 soles home. Thank you.
Okay, this side.
This question is primarily for Professor Sachs and Sen. I was wondering, broadly speaking, what role does education play in sustainable development? Are there specific fields and subject areas that third world countries could encourage their students to study, which would end up helping the economic growth in the long term of that country? And what can people in the first world do to aid those efforts?
Okay, over here, is there, can't see that.
Here, up here. There were two very important events that happened this week in the world, in my view. The first one is the riots in Europe, especially in France. And the second one is the lack of advance in reduction of the subsidies to the agriculture, especially coming in the discussion, especially from Europe. I'd like to know how you see this impacting, if at all, the fight against poverty, and what could be done to change those outcomes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we have various panelists try to answer. Jeff, do you want to begin?
First, there is no one cause of poverty nor one route out of poverty, and I go to great lengths in my own thinking and writing to stress that we need what I call a clinical economics approach, which is a differential diagnosis that understands the specific context of any challenge that you're considering, whether it's Peru or another part of the world. Of course, circumstances differ, and the underlying problems may be social, they may be political, they may be geographic, they may be climatic, and making a proper diagnosis is part of what good, serious thinking and policy making ought to be about. And all of the one type solutions, Hernando de Soto saying, well, all you need to do is, if anyone says all you need to do is, and I don't believe that, well, I hope we don't fall into that trap, but if it's, if you hear all you need to do is, it's almost surely wrong, the end of the sentence. Pardon me? Yes, because many places that are extremely poor, for example, have property rights. I work with a lot of villages. I work with a lot of places where the property rights are nice and secure and people are starving because the land is not productive enough to yield a viable crop right now. So in that place, it's not the leasehold that's going to be the most important thing. It may be amendments to the soil through organic replenishment of soil nutrients that will turn out to be the key. On the question of DDT, it's wonderful to have the Wall Street Journal as an ally in this. You got the sense from the editorial that they were more interested in fighting environmentalism than they were in fighting malaria, actually. Read it, it's interesting. But they're right. DDT is an absolutely acceptable, safe, appropriate approach to control of malaria. Indoor residual spraying is not a human health hazard, nor is it an environmental hazard, nor is it the single approach that you need for malaria. It depends on the ecology, the context, and so forth. But it's a very important tool that has wrongly been shunned in a number of places where it could have a very important effect, and they were right about that. But what they weren't right about was portraying that, by the way, as a UN issue. That's just their mania, because the WHO has been absolutely clear that DDT is an appropriate response in many ecological contexts. It's just a myth that it's been opposed. It's been championed, and it was distinguished in the Persistent Organic Pesticides Treaty as an appropriate exception on exactly these grounds. So there's just a lot of hoo-ha about it, but it is a very important practical tool as part of many other tools. Finally, let me say something about the politics of all of this. There is no one channel to the political change that is required to make the world a better place, if I could put it that way. And if there is going to be change, it's going to be change through individual action. It's going to be changed through social mobilization. It's going to be changed through poor people in their own countries standing up and demanding more. And even when their governments can't provide it, pushing their governments to demand more from the rest of the world, which is sometimes a necessary link. There is no official switch that one's going to turn and get this job done. This is going to require a very broad, complicated social movement for an extended period of time. But don't say it isn't possible. That's how slavery was ended. That's how the colonial era was ended. That's how the civil rights movement progressed. We need a broad social engagement in all parts of the world, both official and private, corporate, philanthropic. Everybody has a role to play.
Well, a number of questions were raised about Europe and Scandinavia in particular. Scandinavia exporting
The angels are singing
the
for us.
angels are singing. Of course, Sweden. I think two things that are very important. One is that all these Northern European countries have taken the UN and UN institutions extremely seriously. It's been very central to their role of themselves in the world to work through the UN and to help UN activities to function better. And that's a really important message. Second, and Jeff touched on this, is a view that there can be innovation in the public sector as well as in the private sector, and there are sort of tremendous joke episodes like the Swedish government sending a mission to Kenya to show them how to collect taxes, which was the sort of subject for limitless bad jokes. But actually, there has been development cooperation on public sector institutions, which has worked very well. The other point, one of the other points that was made about Europe had to do with the riots in Paris, and of course, those of us who are Europeans are thinking about this a lot. I think there is an important point about fear, which we have talked about quite a lot this evening. Gareth in the book talks about the fear of the poor on the part of economists, but the Enlightenment thinkers were also very interested in the ways in which the poor themselves are afraid. And some of the reports some of the reports from Paris suggest that the people described as rioters were themselves very afraid of what their daily life was like. And this, from an Enlightenment point of view, is an extremely sinister social circumstance. And I think there was an ideal of a society in which people didn't have to be afraid in daily life. They didn't have to be afraid of being destitute when they were old and ill, and that's something that the Scandinavian countries have I think, done away with. But they were not afraid of walking in parts of the society, and I think that is something that our European countries have to take very seriously now.
Perhaps just to add one point further on the French case, I mean, it's very noticeable in European television that they find it very hard in France to find political representatives of the people living in the suburbs. I think part of the problem is that there is no political mediation between the people living in these very often rather godforsaken places and the political nation, as it were, who live somewhere else. And I think that's another argument really about why fear develops where there is a great deal of ignorance of what's going on the other side. And that's very clear with the visceral reactions of the French government to a problem they obviously, in human terms, find very hard to imagine what it's about.
Well, there were a number of interesting questions raised. We can't really do justice to them, but just to give a quick response to perhaps three of them. One is to say that the question that was raised about incentives is very important indeed. I think the thing to emphasize here is that any system that is proposed must have some idea about why people will choose to do something rather than something else. But in thinking about the incentive, the thing not to be present in is the idea that the incentives operate in the standard, very standard way in which orthodox theory, standard neoclassical theory has tended us to believe. For one thing, the whole issue of public concern, wanting to do something for a reason other than a narrowly defined self-interest, is something which was very big in Smith, but it's somehow kept out. And oddly enough, it's coming back pretty big way, judging from my students at Harvard, through game theory, because the game theory is fine by and large, that's not how people behave. Now, it's interesting that that insight has to be learned not from observing the way people actually behave in the world, but from experimental games. But nevertheless, a good outcome is always lovely. The other main point to make is that democracy, of course, increases incentives for the civil servants and governments to do many things, because even the connection that exists, which is often oversimplified, as Jeff also mentioned, about functioning democracy and not lack of famine, operates through incentive. It just passes on the penalty of famine on the ruling group, who would be otherwise insulated in the absence of democracy, but in the presence of democracy. It's very hard to win elections after a famine, and there are other ways in which the rulers' lives are affected. Now, we could have said much more on that, but I'm glad that that question was raised. On the subject of DDT, a very good response has already come. Just to add to what Jeff said, there's a very interesting book which I strongly recommend, Cass Sunstein's book, a lawyer, distinguished lawyer in Chicago, called Laws of Fear, where he discusses why there have been this bias towards not allowing things where some kind of mistakes or bad result could come from commission. So the fear of commission has tended to produce a kind of lot of prohibitory rules, which actually are not in the end at all in public interest. So at one stage, it's one side, it indicates that we ought to take all the consequences seriously. It's a praise of a consequential way of looking at public ethics. But it is also, on the other side, making the point that there is a kind of fear of doing harm, which in a sense is almost a kind of laissez-faire instinct to it, though that's not the way Wall Street Journal would have interpreted that issue, where it's blaming in the environmentalists. But there's a general fear that by doing something you can make things harm, therefore try not to do it. So that focus is there, which actually is implicit but comes out quite sharply in that book. The third point to make I wanted to say about education, this was the question that was raised, because education has so many important things, including what Jeff discussed, and of course in Enlightenment context was a major issue, which we also get from Garrett's book. But we have to distinguish the fact that education has importance of its own, which is great. It contributes to employment in a dramatic way economically. It contributes to social change and make democracies more effective. It also has all kinds of effects like gender equality, for example, because nothing is as powerful as women's literacy in generating a more just society in that respect. And you can see the effect of it. And for example, these studies that we were doing in India with all the districts, more than 300 or so, if you make a comparison, the fertility rate changes, which in India vary from 5.1 children per family to 1.7 children, 1.6 children per family, depending on which district you're looking at. The two statistically significant impact, as Mamata Murthy's and Jean Drèze's work brings out in this entire study, and nothing else is significant, is women's literacy and women's gainful employment. And women's literacy is also the most powerful force, not only in reducing fertility, but also in reducing child mortality. Now, fertility is very easy to explain. I mean, the lives that are battered most are that of women, young women, by having more and more children. Anything that increases their voice would tend to reduce fertility rate. And if environmentalists want it for some other reason, the way to get it is not through one-child policy, which really has done very little for China. If you take China's education and China's gainful employment, is bang on the line. And on the other hand, education could make a major difference. So it's really that broader picture that we have to bring in, and of course Jeff discussed many of them.
Well, let me thank all the panelists and the questionings. I think Keynes talked very forcefully about, even though he was an economist, talked not only about the power of interest, but also the power of ideas. And I think these two books really show the power of ideas, and I think they will have influence for a long time. The first idea that poverty can be ended, and the second one is that social democracies may be a way of organizing society that will actually be a better way for improving the general well-being, and that the way we've understood these ideas in the past has been distorted for interesting reasons, and that I think these two books, I think, will be influential for a long period of time. Thank you.
Gareth Stedman Jones, An End to Poverty, is published by Columbia University Press, and you can find out more at columbia.edu/cu/CUP. Jeffrey Sachs, The End of Poverty, is published by Penguin. For more information, visit penguin.com.